There is something almost unsettling about watching a Tommy Korpi arrive in the ruins of his old home. He does not scream. He does not deliver a speech about everything he has lost. He does not even seem interested in explaining himself. Instead, he looks at the remains of a life that was taken from him, reaches for a wooden plank, and begins taking the house apart, piece by piece, board by board, as if grief itself has become a construction project. And that is the moment Sisu 2, Road to Revenge reveals what kind of sequel it wants to be. The first Sisu introduced Korpi as a near-mythological Finnish killing machine, a man who could survive injuries that should have ended any ordinary human life. But this time the film takes that legend and drops him into something even stranger. He is not simply fighting an army. He is trying to transport his literal home across a hostile landscape, while an entire military machine attempts to stop him. The result is an extraordinary collision of wartime trauma, silent film comedy, brutal action, and completely unreasonable physics. At one moment Korpi is carrying the weight of his destroyed past. The next he is using pieces of that past as armor. And eventually, the movie reaches the point where wooden planks become weapons against machinery that should be vastly more powerful than anything a man could possibly survive. This is where Sisu 2 begins to feel less like a conventional World War II action sequel, and more like Evil Dead 2 colliding with Mad Max. Fury Road, filtered through the visual language of Finnish cinema. Its greatest joke is that Korpi himself never laughs. He never explains the joke. He simply survives it. His silence becomes the straight face underneath every impossible stunt. For nearly the entire film, Jorma Tommila's Korpi communicates without relying on conventional dialogue, allowing his eyes, posture, breathing, scars, and increasingly exhausted movements to become his vocabulary. His grief is expressed through action. His anger is expressed through persistence. His memories are expressed through wood. That makes the violence strangely emotional, because beneath every outrageous kill is a man who has already lost almost everything. The film understands that the funniest thing about an indestructible action hero is sometimes how seriously he takes his own survival. Korpi does not behave like a superhero because he believes he is invincible. He behaves like a man who has simply decided that death is no longer allowed to interrupt his unfinished business. And once the Soviet forces realize who has returned to their territory, that unfinished business becomes a road war. What begins as the quiet dismantling of a house slowly transforms into a moving battlefield, and the deeper we travel into that battlefield, the clearer the film's central contradiction becomes. Sisu 2 is spectacularly ridiculous on the surface, but underneath the ridiculousness is a story about what happens when someone refuses to let history erase the place they came from. To understand why that contradiction works, we have to look beyond the individual action sequences and examine how Jalmari Helander builds the entire movie around escalation. Sisu 2 does not simply ask how to make the original bigger. It asks how much bigger the same basic idea can become before it stops functioning as a serious action story and becomes something closer to cinematic folklore. That distinction matters because the movie's approach to action is not based on realism. It is based on internal mythology. Once Korpi has been established as a man who operates according to an almost supernatural logic of survival, every new sequence becomes a test of the audience's willingness to accept that mythology. A fighter plane should be able to destroy a truck carrying wooden boards. A tank should not be something a single man can outmaneuver. A train transporting prisoners should not become the stage for a one-man war against an entire military operation. And yet the movie keeps asking us to accept exactly that. The important question is therefore not whether these moments could happen in reality. The more interesting question is why Helander makes them feel emotionally coherent inside this particular world. That is where the analysis becomes more revealing. The story can be divided into several overlapping layers. The physical journey, the psychological journey, the visual symbolism, the directorial logic, and the soundscape that replaces traditional dialogue. At the center of all five is Corpy's relationship with home. His objective appears absurdly simple. He wants to take the remaining pieces of his house back with him, but the further he travels, the more those pieces become extensions of his identity. The wood protects him, conceals him, blocks bullets, survives explosions, and repeatedly becomes the physical object around which action is organized. In another film, this might be a gimmick. Here it becomes the central visual metaphor. Corpy is literally carrying the evidence that he once belonged somewhere. His enemy wants him to keep moving forward without looking backward. Corpy does the opposite. He takes the past apart so that he can carry it forward. And that is why the confrontation with Yegor Dragunov, played with intimidating physical presence by Stephen Lang, becomes more than a hero versus villain encounter. Dragunov represents a force that destroys and moves on. Corpy represents a man who destroys only because he is trying to preserve something. Their conflict therefore becomes a battle between two different forms of historical trauma. One turns suffering into domination. The other turns suffering into endurance. That distinction will become increasingly important as the journey moves from roads to water, from open landscapes to military transport, and finally onto a train where Corpy is forced to confront the person most directly connected to his personal loss. Even the film's most ridiculous invention, its almost ACME-like use of machinery, becomes relevant to that structure. When a train becomes a weapon and a missile becomes part of the choreography, the movie is essentially turning industrial violence into a giant cartoon mechanism. The question is whether the human being trapped inside that mechanism can remain human. Corpy's answer is almost entirely silent. And perhaps that is why audiences are so drawn to him. There is a long tradition of action heroes who refuse to die. The difference is that Corpy feels less like a modern superhero and more like a missing character from an older cinematic language. His physicality recalls the impossible resilience of classic action cinema, while his deadpan reactions recall silent comedians who could walk through chaos without changing expression. There is something immediately nostalgic about that combination. Viewers who grew up with the muscular heroes of the 1980s understand the appeal of the indestructible warrior. Viewers familiar with Buster Keaton understand the comedy of placing a completely serious face inside an increasingly impossible environment. Corpy combines both traditions. He can be injured like a tragic war survivor and then, moments later, behave like a human-shaped cartoon who has somehow escaped the laws of physics. That tension is precisely what makes the concept of Sisu so useful. Sisu is not simply courage. It is perseverance after ordinary reasons for perseverance have disappeared. It is the decision to keep going when the rational calculation says there is no point. Corpy's entire existence is built around that principle. He has lost his family. He has lost his home. His country has changed around him. The political borders that once defined where he belonged have been transformed by war. Yet he continues carrying pieces of that old identity. The movie places him in a landscape where the old enemy has changed uniforms, but the emotional wound remains. The first film used Nazi soldiers as the primary force threatening him. This story shifts toward Soviet forces and the post-war landscape of Karelia, immediately changing the historical atmosphere. The threat is no longer simply the final violence of a war. It is the uncertainty of what comes after the war, when borders, homes, loyalties, and memories are still being rearranged. That makes Corpy's journey feel strangely contemporary, even while the movie is deliberately nostalgic. Modern audiences have become accustomed to increasingly digital action spectacles, where physics can be altered almost without consequence because entire environments can be generated, destroyed, and reconstructed through visual effects. Sisu 2 takes the opposite emotional route. Even when the action becomes absurd, it wants us to feel the physicality of objects. Wood has weight. Metal has weight. Bodies have weight. Vehicles have weight. The humor often comes from seeing those weights collide in ways that should be impossible. That physical emphasis is one reason the film can feel larger than its budget. It is not necessarily trying to compete with the visual complexity of a $200 million superhero production. It is competing for something else, the memory of a stunt you can actually imagine happening in front of a camera. That distinction becomes important when considering the film's production, its reception, and eventually its place within the broader action genre. But before we can judge whether Sisu 2 succeeds as a sequel, we have to understand how Helander got Corpy from a gold-filled wilderness to a road carrying the remains of an entire house. The original Sisu became a worldwide cult success because it found an unusually simple formula. Take an apparently ordinary man, strip away almost every conventional piece of dialogue and exposition, and turn his survival into a sequence of increasingly savage visual jokes. The sequel could have repeated that formula almost mechanically. Instead, Helander expands the geographical and emotional scale. The production moves into a larger post-war environment, with Estonia providing the locations needed to construct a convincing version of Karelia, while allowing the filmmakers to stage more ambitious vehicle action. The reported production budget of roughly $12 million is modest by contemporary blockbuster standards, but the movie repeatedly behaves as if it has access to resources far beyond that figure. That is not because every shot is necessarily practical. It is because Helander's visual strategy is based on maximizing the perceived size of every physical event. A truck becomes a moving fortress. A stack of timber becomes a shield. A road becomes a battlefield. A train becomes a gigantic mechanical maze. The production design therefore has to do more than make the period look convincing. It has to create objects that can participate in action. Every vehicle, piece of wood, weapon, and structure potentially becomes part of the choreography. This is one of the most important differences between spectacle created through scale and spectacle created through imagination. A giant digital environment can show almost anything. A carefully chosen physical object can make a smaller production feel enormous because the audience immediately understands what it is and what it weighs. Wood is particularly effective because it connects action to emotion. It is not a random prop. It is Corpy's house. The filmmakers can therefore repeat the object across multiple sequences without it feeling like mere set dressing. Every time the lumber survives another attack, the audience subconsciously understands that Corpy's past is surviving with him. Helander's casting also reinforces the movie's deliberate collision between grounded physicality and larger-than-life villainy. Stephen Lang brings a familiar authority to Dragunov, but the performance does not depend entirely on speeches or exposition. His physical presence is enough to establish danger. He moves like a man who has spent years inside violence and has learned to treat cruelty as routine. Richard Brake, meanwhile, provides another dimension of the Soviet machine, embodying the cold administrative side of the conflict. Where Dragunov's personal obsession, the KGB presence represents bureaucracy. One wants Korpi dead. The other represents the system that makes such violence possible. This distinction allows the movie to avoid reducing every antagonist to the same kind of villain. Some are ideological, some are professional, some are simply caught inside the machine. But once Korpi's return becomes known, the system begins closing around him. The resulting chase is not just a pursuit. It is an attempt to prevent him from crossing a physical border with something the authorities believe belongs to the past. In that sense, the house becomes politically significant without needing to become a political speech. Korpi's home is a personal object, but its existence also represents displacement, lost territory, and the stubborn persistence of memory. The sequel's greatest strength is that it can communicate these ideas without abandoning its pulp identity. It never stops being an action movie. It simply allows the action to carry more meaning than the dialogue would have. The pre-release landscape makes that strategy even more interesting. By the time Sisu 2 arrives, the modern audience has already experienced years of enormous franchise filmmaking. Superhero universes, effects-heavy fantasy, legacy sequels, reboots, and interconnected cinematic properties have trained viewers to expect scale as a selling point. A movie like Sisu 2 occupies a strange position in that environment. It is both a sequel and an outsider. It does not have the enormous mythology of a comic book franchise, nor does it require audiences to remember dozens of previous installments. Its marketing can therefore sell one thing with almost perfect clarity: watch this man do impossible things. That simplicity becomes an advantage. The title itself promises a road. The imagery promises revenge. And the trailers can isolate individual stunts and allow their absurdity to generate curiosity. The film does not need to explain an entire cinematic universe. It only needs to make the audience wonder how a man carrying a house can possibly survive an army. That is a remarkably clean premise in an era when blockbuster marketing often has to explain more than it excites. Its festival presence and early genre buzz further position it as the kind of movie that action fans can discover and champion. Yet that also creates a problem. A cult hit often works partly because it feels unexpected. Once the audience knows what made the first film special, the sequel has to recreate surprise while simultaneously satisfying expectations. The safest choice would have been to repeat the original formula with new locations. Helander chooses escalation instead. That means the movie risks becoming too cartoonish, too repetitive, or too dependent on the audience accepting increasingly impossible physics. But it also means the sequel has an identity of its own. Instead of asking whether Korpi can survive another group of soldiers, the film asks how far his survival myth can be stretched before it breaks. The answer, perhaps predictably, is much farther than common sense would allow. That journey begins quietly. In 1946, the war has ended, but the landscape has not recovered from it. Korpi returns to the place where his home once stood and finds not a sanctuary but an absence. The most striking element of the opening is its restraint. The film could have used flashbacks. It could have introduced family photographs, lengthy dialogue, or an explanatory monologue. Instead, it gives us Korpi and the remains of a structure. He studies the house, then begins dismantling it. The action is methodical. Each board matters. Each piece has to be removed carefully enough to survive transportation. There is something almost ritualistic about the process. A man who cannot repair the past decides to take it apart and carry it somewhere else. This immediately establishes the movie's emotional engine. Corpy is not returning simply to retrieve property. He is confronting the physical evidence of a life that no longer exists. The house has become a memorial, and dismantling it is both an act of destruction and preservation. The contradiction is essential. He must destroy the structure in order to save it. That same contradiction will define his entire journey. Every time he destroys something, he is creating a path toward restoration. Every violent encounter becomes another step toward rebuilding. The quietness also reinforces his character. We do not need to hear Corpy explain what the house means because the patience with which he handles every piece tells us enough. This is not a man looking for adventure. Adventure has found him. But the landscape is no longer his alone. Soviet control has transformed the region, and the political reality surrounding Corpy's return is as important as the physical threat. The war may be over, but the consequences of war continue through borders, occupation, displacement, and surveillance. Corpy's attempt to transport his house toward Finland therefore becomes an active movement through a landscape where movement itself is politically controlled. Once Soviet authorities recognize him, the personal journey becomes a military problem. The KGB commander receives information that the man known as Corpy has returned, and suddenly a figure who might have remained an obscure survivor becomes a target. The decision to bring Yegor Dragunov into the story gives the pursuit a personal dimension. Dragunov is not merely another officer ordered to intercept Corpy. He has a history with him. He has been shaped by the same war. But where Corpy carries his trauma silently, Dragunov has allowed violence to become an identity. His release from Siberia and return to the field create a dark symmetry. Two men emerge from the aftermath of war. One wants to recover a home. The other wants to finish a killing. Their paths are therefore destined to cross. Corpy's first major obstacle is not an army in formation. It is a group of motorcycle pursuers who turn his carefully planned journey into a moving ambush. The visual joke is immediate. He is driving a lumber truck loaded with the dismantled remains of his house while armed men pursue him across the road. In a conventional action movie, the truck would be a vulnerable target. Here, the truck becomes an extension of Corpy's survival strategy. The wood is everywhere, and that means Corpy has material to improvise with. Bullets hit boards. Bodies collide with timber. The chase transforms architecture into armor. The absurdity works because the movie commits to it completely. There is no wink to the audience telling us that the physics are ridiculous. Corpy simply behaves as if this is the most reasonable way to transport a house through a war zone. That dead seriousness is what allows the comedy to land. The audience laughs not because the film is mocking Corpy, but because Corpy's determination is so sincere that reality seems increasingly embarrassed by it. The further he travels, the more the road becomes a threshold. At first he is trying to avoid conflict. Then he is responding to attacks. Eventually he is actively fighting his way through them. This is the moment when the film transforms from a journey story into open warfare. Dragunov's hunting tactics make that escalation personal. He does not simply send one group after Corpy and wait for them to fail. He keeps tightening the net. Each encounter teaches the audience something about Corpy's improvisational ability, but it also reveals how much punishment his body has already absorbed. The physical comedy is inseparable from pain. A board can stop a bullet, but it cannot stop everything. Corpy bleeds. He falls. He gets trapped. He keeps moving. The movie's internal rule is not that Corpy cannot be hurt. It is that being hurt does not automatically stop him. That distinction is critical because it preserves the emotional stakes. If he were literally invulnerable, the action would become meaningless. Instead, his body becomes a record of every obstacle he has endured. His scars are not proof that he feels nothing. They are proof that he has continued despite feeling everything. Then the scale expands again. The conflict moves beyond motorcycles and trucks and reaches the sky. A Soviet fighter aircraft becomes the next instrument of destruction, and the movie responds with one of its defining images. Corpy using the lumber around him to challenge an enemy that should be completely beyond his physical reach. It is the kind of moment that sounds ridiculous when described and somehow becomes iconic when seen. A wooden plank has no business competing with a fighter aircraft. Yet in the strange logic of Sisu 2, the plank represents something more powerful than its material strength. It represents the accumulated weight of Corpy's past. The airplane is machinery. The wood is memory. The movie turns that metaphor into slapstick action. It is almost a silent film gag scaled up to military proportions. Buster Keaton might have placed a character beneath a collapsing building. Helander places Corpy beneath modern warfare, and asks him to keep carrying his house anyway. The ocean sequence pushes the same principle into another environment. When heavy artillery makes the road untenable, Corpy drives into the water, transforming the truck into an improvised vessel. Again, the absurdity is not simply that a truck enters the ocean. It is that Corpy remains concerned with the lumber. The boards must survive. The house must survive. Even when the truck is no longer functioning as a conventional vehicle, its cargo remains the mission. This creates one of the film's recurring jokes. The audience keeps expecting Corpy to abandon the wood because survival should logically take priority. But Corpy's priorities are different. Survival without recovery is incomplete. He is not merely trying to escape the enemy. He is trying to arrive somewhere with proof that he once had a home. By the time the action reaches the border barrier and the tank flip, the film has essentially announced that realism is no longer the governing principle. Escalation is. The tank is bigger than the truck. The military hardware is more powerful than Corpy's improvised weapons. Yet each escalation is answered by an even more ridiculous use of physical space. The choreography becomes a contest between machinery and ingenuity. This is where the influence of classic slapstick becomes unmistakable. Silent comedy often worked by placing ordinary people inside environments that were too large, too fast, or too dangerous for them. The humor came from watching them adapt. Corpy is the ultimate expression of that idea. He is not an ordinary man, but his silence makes him feel like one. He does not explain how he will escape. He simply finds something nearby and turns it into a solution. His injuries also become part of the choreography. Weapons are concealed inside wounds. Objects are hidden in places no sane person would use as storage. And his own damaged body becomes another piece of equipment. This is grotesque, but it is also thematically precise. Corpy's body has become a survival container. His scars are not only reminders of what happened to him, they are resources he can use to continue. The film repeatedly turns damage into utility. What should symbolize weakness becomes strength. What should stop him becomes another tool. This is perhaps the most literal expression of Sisu in the entire movie. Endurance is not presented as the absence of suffering. It is the ability to make something out of suffering. Eventually, however, even Korpi reaches a point where improvisation is no longer enough. Dragunov captures him and places him aboard a train bound toward Siberia. The movement of the story changes dramatically here. Until this point, Korpi has controlled his direction, however chaotic the circumstances. Now he is contained. The road becomes a train. The open landscape becomes a series of enclosed carriages. His freedom disappears. More importantly, the train forces Korpi into direct proximity with the man responsible for the deepest wound in his past. The revelation that Dragunov was personally involved in the murder of Korpi's wife and children changes the emotional meaning of the entire chase. Suddenly, this is not simply about recovering a house. It is about confronting the person who helped destroy the life that house represented. Dragunov's presence on the train therefore functions as a psychological trap. Korpi has spent the film moving forward, but the past has finally caught up with him. The physical violence becomes harsher because the emotional distance has disappeared. Dragunov is no longer a distant enemy somewhere behind the truck. He is in the same confined space. He knows what he did. Korpi knows what he did. The film does not need a lengthy confrontation because the silence between them contains the history. Korpi's face becomes particularly important here. The legendary warrior disappears for a moment, and what remains is a grieving man staring at someone who embodies the worst memory of his life. The movie's earlier comedy suddenly acquires a darker edge. We have laughed at Korpi's impossible survival because it felt like a fantasy. Now we understand why he needs that fantasy. If he stops moving, he has to confront what happened. The train sequence becomes his lowest physical state. He is tortured, battered, restrained, and deprived of the freedom that allowed him to improvise. Dragunov, meanwhile, begins turning against his own handlers, revealing that his obsession with Korpi is stronger than his loyalty to the system. This is where the antagonist's psychology becomes clear. Dragunov does not fight because he believes in something greater than himself. He fights because violence has become the only language through which he understands power. Korpi has a purpose beyond revenge, even when revenge is part of his motivation. Dragunov has only revenge. That difference separates them. One man is trying to return somewhere. The other is trying to destroy the person who refuses to disappear. Korpi's eventual escape, therefore, feels less like a superhero transformation than the final activation of a mechanism that has been building throughout the entire story. He uses hidden weapons, damaged resources, and sheer physical determination to break free. The train becomes a battlefield. Carriage by carriage, the movie returns to its silent comedy roots. But now the comedy is fused with desperation. Korpi moves through the train like a ghost who has learned how to manipulate every confined space. Soldiers become obstacles. Doors become traps. Machinery becomes weapons. The choreography turns architecture into action, and the audience begins to understand why the train is the perfect setting for the climax. A road gives Korpi freedom of direction. A train gives him almost none. Every carriage creates a new problem. Every transition becomes a miniature puzzle. The film's use of ballistic machinery pushes this concept to its most outrageous extreme. The train itself becomes associated with missiles and military hardware, turning the vehicle into a gigantic weapon moving through the landscape. It is almost an ACME contraption from a violent cartoon, except the consequences are bloody and physical. That collision of tones is the defining quality of Sisu 2. The movie wants the audience to laugh at the absurdity of the mechanism and recoil from the brutality of what happens to human bodies inside it. This is why the film's violence cannot be understood separately from its comedy. The exaggerated gore is part of the same visual language. Bones crunch loudly. Wood splinters dramatically. Bodies are thrown through spaces with almost impossible precision. The sound and image constantly exaggerate impact until violence begins functioning like punctuation. The final confrontation between Korpi and Dragunov is therefore less about discovering who is stronger and more about deciding what their suffering has made them. Dragunov has allowed the war to consume whatever human purpose he might once have possessed. Korpi has also been consumed by violence, but he has maintained one connection to something outside himself: home. That is why the final kill matters. It is not simply a revenge payoff. It is the removal of the person who represents the final obstacle between Korpi and restoration. Dragunov dies through the same inventive brutality that has defined the film's action. But the story does not end with celebration. It ends with silence. Korpi returns to Finland carrying the pieces of his house. And then something unexpected happens. The people around him begin helping. No grand speech is necessary. No one needs to tell Korpi that he belongs there. They simply begin rebuilding. The same wood that earlier functioned as armor now becomes construction material again. The object that protected Korpi through violence becomes the foundation of community. This is the quiet reversal at the center of the film. For most of the story, Korpi believes he must carry everything alone. The ending reveals that endurance does not necessarily mean carrying everything forever. Sometimes Sisu means surviving long enough to discover that you no longer have to rebuild alone. That makes Tommy Korpi a far more interesting character than his reputation as an immortal killing machine initially suggests. On the surface, his objective is concrete: retrieve his home and return to Finland. Beneath that objective is something much more fragile. He is trying to recover a sense of continuity after war has severed it. The house represents a life that existed before violence transformed him. By dismantling it, he is acknowledging that the old version of his life cannot simply be restored. He cannot put the original structure back exactly as it was. He has to rebuild it somewhere else. That is a surprisingly mature metaphor hidden inside an action movie that includes fighter planes, tanks, and impossible train weapons. Jorma Tommila's performance is crucial because the character could easily have become a caricature. A silent hero can be emotionally empty if the actor does not communicate what silence means. Tommila avoids that trap through tiny changes in posture and expression. Korpi's silence is not the silence of someone with nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who has already said everything internally. His eyes often appear to be evaluating the physical world rather than reacting emotionally to it. But when the story brings him face to face with his family's killer, the emotional layer becomes visible. The contrast makes the earlier action more meaningful. Korpi can survive extraordinary punishment because his body has become accustomed to suffering. But that does not mean he is emotionally untouched by it. His scars function almost like a map of Finnish history. They show what happens when violence becomes something a person carries long after the official conflict has ended. Every injury is evidence that survival has a cost. Yet the film refuses to make Korpi helpless or fragile. Instead, it transforms his scars into another element of his myth. This is where the legend of the immortal becomes psychologically interesting. Other characters see Korpi as a supernatural force. The audience gradually understands that what looks like immortality is actually an extreme form of refusal. He refuses to surrender. He refuses to abandon the wood. He refuses to stop moving. He refuses to let the person who destroyed his family define the final chapter of his life. That is also why the final image of Corpy matters so much. When he is finally disarmed, surrounded by people who want to help him rebuild, the myth begins to dissolve. The warrior no longer needs to be invincible. He can simply be a man. That transition is the emotional endpoint of the character arc. The movie spends most of its runtime proving that Corpy can survive alone. The ending quietly asks whether surviving alone is actually the same thing as living. The answer is no. The house can be rebuilt only when other people join him. His strength remains important, but community gives that strength a destination. Dragunov provides the perfect opposite. Stephen Lang's performance works because he does not need to compete with Corpy by becoming equally mythological. Instead, he becomes a darker reflection of the same war-shaped physicality. Both men have been hardened by violence. Both understand survival. Both possess extraordinary endurance. But their purposes are completely different. Corpy is carrying something. Dragunov is erasing something. Corpy wants to recover a home. Dragunov wants to eliminate the man who represents a memory he cannot control. That makes their conflict a battle between preservation and destruction. Dragunov's release from Siberia initially suggests a man who wants freedom. But freedom is not enough for him. He immediately redirects his energy toward Corpy. That tells us that the prison was never his only cage. His obsession is another one. He cannot imagine a life beyond violence because violence has become the structure through which he understands himself. In that sense, he is more trapped than Corpy. Corpy can leave the battlefield and rebuild. Dragunov can only continue the battle. His military authority therefore hides a psychological weakness. He needs Corpy to complete his own story. Lang's physical acting reinforces that idea. Dragunov carries himself with military confidence, but beneath it is something feral. He does not have Corpy's stoic economy. His presence often feels invasive. He takes up space because he wants to dominate it. Corpy, by contrast, can disappear into the environment. He hides beneath structures, moves through vehicles, and uses the landscape against his enemies. Dragunov tries to control the environment. Corpy adapts to it. That difference explains why the pursuit repeatedly favors Corpy even when Dragunov has superior resources. The supporting characters help establish the larger machinery around this central conflict. Richard Brake's KGB officer is especially useful because he represents the bureaucratic coldness that surrounds Dragunov's personal obsession. He is not necessarily driven by the same emotional hatred. His role is to ensure that the system continues functioning. Corpy is a problem because he exists outside that system. He has returned to a territory where his identity has become politically inconvenient. The officer's detached authority therefore makes the world feel larger than the individual revenge story. The Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, often function like the henchmen of a violent Looney Tunes universe. Their narrative purpose is to provide bodies for Corpy's improvisational choreography. They are repeatedly placed in situations where their military training is defeated by a man using whatever object happens to be nearby. This can be criticized as dehumanizing or repetitive, but within the film's stylized language, it is intentional. They are not presented primarily as psychologically complex individuals. They are extensions of the machine Corpy is trying to escape. Their defeat becomes a visual demonstration of the machine's inability to understand the individual. The Finnish villagers in the ending provide the necessary correction. They are not there to fight. They are there to rebuild. After a movie filled with bodies being destroyed, the final act of creation becomes surprisingly powerful. Community appears almost as the opposite of violence. The soldiers use force to take. Korpi uses force to recover. The villagers use cooperation to restore. That progression allows the film to end emotionally rather than simply spectacularly. This brings us to the central theme, home. Sisu 2 appears to be about revenge, but revenge is only the mechanism that gets Korpi to the end of the road. The deeper story is about preservation. He does not spend the movie trying to recover every person he lost because that is impossible. He cannot reverse history. What he can do is refuse to let the physical symbol of that history disappear. The wooden house becomes a portable memory. Every plank is a fragment of a life. When Korpi carries those fragments across hostile territory, he is effectively refusing to allow displacement to become erasure. That is why rebuilding works as a metaphor for trauma. Trauma cannot always be erased. Sometimes the goal is to create a new structure around what remains. Korpi cannot restore his family. He cannot restore the political landscape of his childhood. He cannot undo the murders that shaped him. But he can take what survived and construct something new. The movie's definition of Sisu therefore becomes more complicated than simple toughness. True perseverance is not merely refusing to fall. It is deciding what deserves to be carried after you have fallen. The wooden planks embody that idea perfectly. At different points they function as cargo, armor, weapons, barriers, hiding places, and eventually construction material. Their meaning changes according to context, but they always remain connected to home. The film's visual palette strengthens the metaphor. The colder Soviet environments are dominated by muted grays, icy terrain, mud, metal, and military machinery. Against that world, the natural warmth of the wood becomes visually significant. The boards carry the color and texture of something human-made for living rather than killing. They are imperfect. They splinter. They become dirty. Yet they remain recognizable as parts of a home. Korpi's scars operate similarly. His body is another object marked by history. The concealed blades and hidden weapons inside his injuries turn wounds into survival tools. But the metaphor goes deeper. His body is carrying what happened to him just as the truck carries the house. The physical and emotional burdens are mirrored. The house has been broken apart, and so has Korpi. Both are still capable of being rebuilt. Even the roads and train tracks carry symbolic meaning. They are lines imposed across the landscape, determining where people can move. Borders separate spaces that once felt continuous. Trains transport people according to routes they do not control. Korpi's struggle is therefore constantly staged against systems of forced movement. He is trying to choose his destination in a world designed to choose it for him. The fact that he carries his home while doing so makes the image almost painfully direct. The historical subtext adds another layer. The story's post-war Karelia setting evokes the trauma of displacement and the evacuation associated with the territorial changes surrounding Finland during and after the Second World War. The movie does not present itself as a history lecture, and it should not be evaluated as one. It transforms historical memory into pulp mythology. Korpi becomes larger than an individual soldier. He becomes an embodiment of the people who lost homes, landscapes, and continuity, and were forced to carry memory elsewhere. That transformation explains why the film feels connected to folklore. Folklore often takes real suffering and gives it a symbolic body. The warrior becomes a giant. The survivor becomes immortal. The landscape becomes enchanted. In Sisu too, Korpi becomes almost elemental. He is less a conventional protagonist than a force that refuses to be moved. The Soviet machinery may have tanks, aircraft, guns, trains, and institutional authority, but Korpi has one advantage. He has nothing left to lose except the thing he is carrying. The silent film influence becomes especially important here. Buster Keaton's characters often remain emotionally restrained, while the world around them becomes increasingly chaotic. Their comedy comes from the contrast between expression and environment. Helander adapts that principle to modern action. Korpi's expression barely changes while explosions, vehicles, weapons, and bodies move around him. The difference is that Helander adds the physical brutality of contemporary action cinema. The result is a strange hybrid, silent comedy with splatter effects. Charlie Chaplin's influence can also be felt in the relationship between vulnerability and dignity. The silent protagonist is often funny because the audience sees the absurdity of the situation, while the character remains committed to his objective. Korpi's objective is even more serious. He is carrying home. That gives the comedy a melancholy foundation. We laugh at the impossibility of his journey, while understanding why he refuses to abandon it. This is also where the movie subverts the classic Western. Traditionally, the lone gunslinger rides into a dangerous frontier, defeats the forces threatening a community, and rides away. Korpi resembles that figure, but his journey has a crucial difference. He does not ride away into the horizon as an eternal outsider. He returns carrying something that can reconnect him to community. The landscape is not an American frontier. It is a Nordic environment shaped by snow, mud, forests, borders, and wartime memory. The mythology is therefore distinctly Finnish even when the action language is globally recognizable. The production design and visual effects have to support this mythology without making the film feel weightless. This is where the practical work becomes particularly important. Real vehicles, heavy timber rigs, explosive choreography, stunt performance, and carefully controlled environments provide the physical foundation. Visual effects can enhance scale, remove practical limitations, or extend environments, but the audience still needs to believe that objects occupy space. A wooden plank must feel like wood. A truck must feel heavy. A body hitting a surface must appear to experience resistance. When practical elements are convincing, digital enhancements become almost invisible because the audience accepts the physical world first. The tank flip is a good example of the balance. The sequence is absurd in concept, but its effectiveness depends on weight. The tank has to look massive. The truck has to appear vulnerable. The movement has to create the sensation of momentum before the impossible result occurs. If everything looked digitally weightless, the joke would collapse. The same principle applies to the train and missile sequences. The larger the spectacle becomes, the more important physical grounding becomes. The gore operates under the same philosophy. The film does not attempt to make violence realistic in a documentary sense. It makes impact exaggerated. Blood, splinters, metal, and bodies become exaggerated punctuation marks. That is why the violence can be simultaneously horrific and funny. The audience recognizes that the movie is operating inside a heightened register. It is not asking us to believe that every injury is medically plausible. It is asking us to believe that this world has a specific visual grammar in which physical consequences are enormous. Jalmari Helander's direction is especially effective when he allows the camera to observe rather than over-explain. The framing often gives the action enough space to breathe. Instead of cutting every moment into fragments, the film can let the audience understand the relationship between Korpi, the vehicle, and the environment. This is essential for physical comedy. A joke loses power if the audience cannot understand what caused it. The camera therefore becomes part of the stunt design. Hellander's earlier work in films such as Rare Exports and Big Game prepared him for this tonal balance. He has long demonstrated an interest in combining genre conventions with eccentric humor. Sisu takes that tendency and strips away much of the dialogue. The result is a filmmaking style that relies heavily on visual rhythm. Chapter-like structures and escalating sequences give the film a comic book momentum. Each stage feels like another level of a game in which the obstacles become more ridiculous. The pacing is therefore less about conventional dramatic development and more about escalation. The question is not always what will happen next, but how can the next thing possibly be bigger than this? That is a dangerous strategy because escalation can eventually become exhausting. Yet it also gives the movie its identity. A sequel that merely repeats the original's level of action might feel safe but forgettable. Sisu 2 deliberately risks excess. Sound becomes crucial because Corpy has almost no dialogue. If the protagonist is not speaking, the world itself has to speak for him. The score and sound design therefore carry emotional information that a conventional action movie might deliver through conversation. Deep vocal textures, heavy brass, metallic percussion, mechanical rhythms, and moments of acoustic emptiness create a substitute language around Corpy. The Soviet side of the soundscape can be associated with machinery and structure. Engines, weapons, trains, and marching rhythms suggest an organized system. Corpy's presence is often represented through heavier, more primal textures. The contrast is subtle but important. One side sounds industrial, the other sounds physical. The music turns the conflict into an auditory version of the same symbolic struggle between machinery and human endurance. Silence itself becomes one of the score's most powerful instruments. When the movie temporarily strips away engines, gunfire, and musical intensity, the absence becomes meaningful. Corpy is alone again. The audience can hear wind, footsteps, breathing, or the movement of a vehicle. Those quiet moments remind us that beneath the action spectacle is a man moving through an enormous landscape with almost no one beside him. The sound effects also contribute heavily to the comedy. A wooden plank breaking can sound absurdly loud. A punch can carry a massive impact. A body can hit the ground with a deliberately exaggerated crunch. These sounds create a physical exaggeration that complements the visual exaggeration. In a film where the protagonist rarely speaks, the sound of the world becomes his dialogue. This is especially effective during stealth sequences. Corpy moving through sleeping soldiers can be tense without requiring a single spoken word. Every footstep becomes a decision. Every creak of wood becomes a potential alarm. The audience begins listening the way Corpy listens. That creates identification through sound rather than dialogue. The train amplifies this effect. Metal corridors echo. Wheels create repetitive rhythms. Machinery becomes a constant presence. The confined environment allows small sounds to become threatening. A door opening can be louder than an explosion because the audience understands what it might mean. The film uses this acoustic geography to make the train feel alive. By the time audiences began encountering the film's most outrageous clips online, the movie had already built the perfect conditions for viral reaction. A fighter plane being challenged with wooden material is the kind of image that requires almost no context. It communicates its own absurdity instantly. Social media thrives on moments that can be understood in seconds, and Sisu 2 produces those moments repeatedly. Corpy naturally invites comparisons to characters like John Wick, Doomguy, and even Wile E. Coyote, depending on which part of his personality the viewer focuses on. He has the unstoppable reputation of a modern action icon, the physical punishment tolerance of a video game character, and the deadpan relationship with impossible physics found in classic cartoons. Yet the comparison to Wile E. Coyote is particularly revealing because Corpy is the opposite of the character's usual fate. The world repeatedly attempts to destroy him with increasingly elaborate mechanisms, but instead of being permanently defeated, he keeps adapting. That meme-friendly absurdity helped the movie stand apart. Rather than pretending that action cinema had to become increasingly realistic, Sisu too embraced its artificiality. It understood that audiences can enjoy impossible action when the filmmakers establish a consistent tone. The film's confidence became part of the entertainment. Its reception also illustrates the complicated relationship between theatrical performance and cultural impact. A film can underperform in cinemas and still become highly visible later through streaming. In an environment where audiences increasingly discover movies through home platforms, theatrical attendance is no longer the only measure of cultural success. A movie that inspires clips, memes, recommendations, and repeat viewing can develop a second life long after its initial release. That second life is especially significant for a film like Sisu 2 because cult status depends on discovery. The movie does not need every viewer to love it immediately. It needs enough viewers to become evangelists. Someone watches the fighter plane sequence, tells a friend, the friend watches the train sequence, and suddenly the film becomes a recommendation rather than a marketing campaign. That is how genre movies become cultural objects. Streaming can accelerate that process. A film that might have been difficult to find in theaters can become instantly available to millions of people. Its outrageous premise becomes an algorithmic invitation. A man carrying a house while fighting Soviet forces. The concept alone is enough to generate curiosity. The movie's long-term influence therefore may be less about copying individual stunts and more about proving that high-concept action can succeed without blockbuster resources. Nordic cinema has historically produced internationally respected films across many genres, but Sisu demonstrates how a distinctly Finnish identity can coexist with globally accessible genre language. The film does not hide where it comes from. Its landscape, mythology, history, and concept of Sisu are central to the action rather than decorative. That matters in an industry where mid-budget action films increasingly struggle to find theatrical space between enormous franchise productions and small streaming projects. Sisu 2 occupies the middle. It is ambitious enough to feel cinematic but focused enough to avoid requiring a gigantic mythology. Its success as a cult object suggests that audiences still want original action concepts, especially when the concept can be explained in one sentence. Critics and audiences, however, are not always looking for the same thing. Critical praise often rewards confidence of execution. A critic can recognize that the movie knows exactly what tone it wants and executes that tone consistently. Some viewers may respond differently. Someone who loved the harsher, more grounded feeling of the first Sisu might find the sequel's escalation excessive. What was once surprising becomes expected. Once Korpi has already survived impossible violence, the challenge is to create new stakes without simply making the violence louder. That is where the debate over bigger is better sequels becomes relevant. Escalation is not automatically improvement. Bigger action can create diminishing returns. A motorcycle chase feels dangerous because motorcycles are recognizable. A fighter plane introduces a completely different scale. A tank introduces another. A missile train introduces another again. Eventually the audience may stop wondering whether Korpi can survive, and start wondering what bizarre object the filmmakers will use next. For some viewers that is exactly the appeal. For others it weakens suspense. Both reactions are valid. The sequel's greatest strength and greatest weakness are essentially the same decision. It refuses to restrain itself. There are also legitimate criticisms of the middle sections. When the film relies on conventional gunfights, rather than its more inventive environmental choreography, some sequences can feel less distinctive. Korpi fighting through ordinary soldiers is entertaining, but it is not necessarily as memorable as Korpi using the physical structure of his surroundings to survive. The movie is at its best when the environment itself becomes the weapon. The question of CGI also deserves a balanced assessment. Visual effects are not inherently a weakness. The issue is whether they preserve the physical sensation established by the practical elements. When digital enhancements become too visible, the film risks losing the tactile quality that makes its absurdity convincing. The audience can forgive impossible physics more easily than weightless physics. We can accept that Corpy performs something impossible if the movement feels physically committed. The tank flip and missile train sequences sit at the outer limit of that acceptance. They are not trying to be plausible. They are trying to be spectacular. The audience has to decide whether the spectacle remains connected to the movie's internal emotional logic. Because Corpy's journey is so clearly tied to the house and the family he lost, the absurdity can still feel purposeful. But there is a point at which repeated exaggeration can become desensitizing. When every injury is enormous, enormous injuries eventually become normal. That is the central danger of hyperviolence. If everything is shocking, nothing remains shocking. Sisu 2 attempts to avoid this by making violence funny, but that strategy will not work equally for every viewer. Some audiences will see the gore as deliberate cartoon language. Others may feel that the movie occasionally crosses into spectacle for spectacle's sake. The indestructible lumber device has a similar problem. As symbolism, it is brilliant. As a plot mechanism, it can become convenient. The wood survives because the story needs it to survive. The audience accepts this because the movie has already established its heightened reality. But the more frequently the lumber rescues Corpy, the more visible the narrative machinery becomes. This tension ultimately defines the film. It is a movie about a man carrying pieces of his home, but it is also a movie constantly carrying pieces of other genres. It borrows from war cinema, revenge thrillers, westerns, silent comedy, action blockbusters, cartoons, and folklore. Sometimes those elements blend beautifully, sometimes they collide, but the collisions are part of what makes the film memorable. Financially, the story becomes even more interesting because a reported production budget around $12 million puts the movie in a completely different economic category from the blockbusters it visually imitates. Its reported worldwide theatrical performance of roughly $9.8 million would appear disappointing against that budget if theatrical revenue were the only measurement. Yet the economics of modern genre filmmaking are more complicated. International distribution, licensing, home entertainment, and streaming can change the long-term value of a film. Theatrical release can also function as marketing. A movie that opens in cinemas creates reviews, social media clips, festival conversations, and audience reactions. Those signals can make the eventual streaming release more valuable. For a cult action film, the theatrical run can effectively serve as the first chapter of its cultural campaign. That is why the future of the Sisu franchise becomes an intriguing question. Once a movie has already reached the level of tanks, aircraft, and missile trains, what is left? A third film would have to find a new dimension, rather than simply adding another larger vehicle. Perhaps the challenge would be to reduce the scale again, and explore Corpy's life after the mythology has been established. The most interesting sequel might actually be the one that asks what happens when the immortal warrior no longer has an army to fight. Hollander's position within European genre cinema is also strengthened by this approach. His films demonstrate that high-concept action does not require an American studio identity to travel internationally. A Finnish protagonist, Finnish mythology, Finnish historical memory, and Nordic landscapes can support an action language that audiences anywhere can understand. That is perhaps the industry's most useful lesson. Originality does not necessarily require inventing a completely new genre. Sometimes it means taking familiar ingredients and arranging them around a specific cultural identity. Sisu is recognizable as action cinema, but it does not feel interchangeable with American action cinema. The difference is Corpy himself and the idea of Sisu that surrounds him. Within Finnish cinematic history, that distinction matters. A film centered on national trauma, displacement, and resilience could easily have become a solemn historical drama. Sisu 2 instead transforms those themes into a pulpy action myth. That may be why its potential legacy is larger than its budget. It demonstrates that historical memory can be communicated through genre, without being reduced to exposition. Recognition through genre institutions and awards can further reinforce that significance, but the most important legacy may be simpler. Corpy joins the growing family of modern action archetypes whose identities can be recognized through movement, rather than dialogue. John Wick has his suit and gun. Mad Max has his vehicle and wasteland. Corpy has scars, silence, and wood. The character's visual simplicity gives him longevity. Practical stunts age differently from effects that depend heavily on a specific digital aesthetic. Silent acting also ages well because emotion does not require translation. A viewer can understand Corpy's exhaustion, anger, or relief without needing to know every detail of Finnish history. Some aspects of the film may inevitably date. Digital blood enhancements, certain bullet effects, and secondary action sequences may become more visibly tied to their production era. But the core physical choreography should remain easier to revisit. A real-looking vehicle moving through a real environment has a tactile quality that does not depend entirely on technological novelty. The silent ending may be the most timeless element of all. After nearly an entire film built around violence, the most meaningful moment is not a kill. It is a community helping a man rebuild. Corpy has spent the story proving that he can survive anything. The final scene proves something more important. He can finally stop surviving for a moment. That is why Sisu 2 works best when understood not as a contest between realism and absurdity, but as a story about grief expressed through absurdity. The movie's violence is ridiculous because Corpy's emotional burden is almost impossible to represent literally. Instead of giving him speeches about trauma, Helander gives him a house, a truck, an army, a train, and a seemingly endless supply of enemies. The result is a strange kind of cinematic language. Corpy's silence gives the audience room to interpret him. The action gives us his external behavior. The wood gives us his memory. The scars give us his history. The landscape gives us his displacement. And the ending gives us his future. If there is one major weakness, it is that the middle of the movie occasionally slows when the action temporarily becomes conventional. The most inventive sequences are so distinctive that ordinary shootouts inevitably feel less memorable by comparison. But that weakness does not erase the film's central achievement. Sisu 2 does not simply reproduce the first movie. It makes the dangerous decision to become stranger, larger, and more openly comic. And perhaps that is the right final judgment. Sisu 2 is not the kind of sequel that asks how to preserve the exact formula that made its predecessor successful. It asks how far that formula can be pushed. Sometimes the answer is excessive. Sometimes it is hilarious. Sometimes it is genuinely moving. And occasionally all three happen in the same sequence. The greatest surprise is that beneath all the splintering wood, exploding machinery, impossible survival, and brutal revenge, the movie has a remarkably simple emotional idea. We carry the pieces of what was destroyed until we find somewhere to put them back together. Corpy spends the entire journey believing that endurance means carrying everything himself. But the final act quietly changes that definition. The strongest person in the story is not necessarily the one who can carry the heaviest load. It may be the person who survives long enough to allow someone else to help carry it. That is why the final silent emotion matters more than another explosion ever could. When Corpy is finally surrounded not by enemies but by neighbors, the warrior becomes human again. The myth of the immortal gives way to the reality of a wounded man. There is no battlefield left to conquer. There is only a home waiting to be rebuilt. And maybe that is what true Sisu means. Not simply refusing to die. Not simply defeating the person who hurt you. not even simply surviving when survival seems impossible. True endurance is reaching the other side of suffering, without allowing suffering to become the only thing left inside you. Corpy carries his house because he refuses to let loss have the final word. Then, at the end, he learns that rebuilding is not something he has to do alone. That is what makes Sisu 2, Road to Revenge more than a collection of spectacular kills. It is a revenge film disguised as a rebuilding story, a silent comedy disguised as a war movie, and a Finnish historical metaphor disguised as an outrageous action spectacle. Its greatest image is not the fighter plane, the tank, or the missile train. It is the wooden house returning to life piece by piece. And that is where Corpy's journey finally ends. Not with another enemy falling, but with something broken becoming whole again. If there is one action sequence from the film that you think best captures its bizarre mixture of brutality, comedy, and creativity, let us know which one stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy deep cinematic essays that look beyond the explosions to uncover the psychology, symbolism, filmmaking, and cultural meaning underneath them, subscribe for more.